She was planning to use it against me, all of it.
This wasn't just theft. It was a campaign to control your entire estate.
My God, everything.
The name on the author page wasn't her husband's. It was a stranger's. Her late Frank's words, his very soul poured onto the fragile yellowed pages of his war diary, were being sold for $2.99 on a website she'd never heard of. This was impossible, a ghost story for the digital age. Susan, her kind, tech-savvy daughter-in-law, had sworn the digitizing process was just for family, a private archive to preserve Frank's memory. The familiar silence of the empty house, once a source of comfort and quiet contemplation, suddenly felt less like peace and more like a tomb. An oppressive weight settled in the air, thick with unspoken things, with violations she was only just beginning to grasp. This wasn't a mistake. Not a simple misunderstanding typed out by careless fingers on a keyboard. This was a violation of the deepest kind. The request was so unusual that he agreed immediately, his voice laced with concern. When he arrived, she had the evidence laid out on the dining table, just as she had for Eleanor and Mr. Hayes. She made him a cup of coffee, her hands steady now. She had him sit down. "David," she began, her voice even, "I love you more than anything in this world. And what I'm about to tell you is going to be the hardest thing you've ever had to hear. But you need to hear it from me." She started with the diary. She showed him the e-book, the grant, the stolen passages. His initial reaction was exactly what she had feared, disbelief laced with a protective instinct for his wife. "Mom, there must be a mistake. Susan would never..." She loves Dad's stories. She wanted to honor him. Maybe she got carried away? "Are you sure you're not just lonely? Misinterpreting things?" Martha didn't argue. She simply pushed the next set of papers in front of him. The bank statements. The highlighted charges. The $5,000 transfer. She explained the shell company, the connections to Susan's family. She could see the denial in his eyes warring with the cold, hard evidence. His face grew pale. He shook his head, looking from the papers to his mother, his expression one of desperate, wounded confusion. "But why?" he stammered. "We don't need money. I make a good living. Why would she do this?" "This is the hardest part, David," Martha said gently. Her heart ached for the pain she was about to cause him, and she told him the secret. She told him about the baby, about the shame she had carried, about the confession to his father. She told him how Susan had read it in the diary and was now holding it over her, using it as a weapon. She doesn't want $5,000, David. She wants everything. She believes I will give it all to her to keep this quiet, to protect you from the scandal. David stared at her, his coffee forgotten, his face a mask of shock. He was not looking at the papers anymore. He was looking at her, really looking at her, seeing not just his mother, but a woman with a life, a past, a history of pain he had never known. The anger he felt toward Susan was eclipsed for a moment by a wave of profound, heartbreaking empathy for his mother. Tears welled in his eyes, and he didn't try to hide them. "You carried that alone?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "All this time?" "Your father knew," she said softly. "He helped me carry it." He reached across the table and took her hand. His grip was strong, like his father's. The fight in his eyes, the dawning, terrible understanding was also his father's. The denial was gone, burned away by the truth. In its place was a cold, quiet rage. "What do we do?" he asked. The "we" was the most beautiful word she had ever heard. She was no longer alone. The final confrontation was not what Martha had imagined. There was no dramatic drawing room scene with accusations flying. It was colder, more clinical, and far more terrifying. On the advice of Mr. Hayes, they arranged a meeting at his office. The pretext was a discussion about Martha's estate planning, something Susan had been pushing for. David called Susan and told her his mother was finally ready to sign the power of attorney documents and update her will. It was the perfect bait, and Susan took it eagerly. She arrived at the law office looking polished and confident, dressed in a sharp business suit, a leather portfolio under her arm. She smiled warmly at Martha, a perfect picture of the devoted daughter-in-law. Martha, I'm so glad you're taking these steps. It's so important to have everything in order. David stood beside his mother, his face a stony mask, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. They were shown into a conference room. Mr. Hayes was already seated at the head of the long, polished table. He stood politely as they entered. "Susan, thank you for coming," he said, his tone neutral. "Please, have a seat." Susan sat, placing her portfolio on the table. She looked expectantly at the lawyer, a flicker of impatience in her eyes. "So, are these the documents for Martha to sign?" "No," Mr. Hayes said calmly. "We're not here to discuss Martha's will. We're here to discuss yours." He gestured to the folder in front of him. "Specifically, your criminal and civil liabilities stemming from multiple acts of fraud, theft, and attempted extortion against your mother-in-law, Martha Peterson." The smile vanished from Susan's face. Her color drained away, leaving a pasty gray complexion. Her eyes darted from Mr. Hayes to David, and finally to Martha. In Martha's steady, unafraid gaze, Susan saw that the game was over. A quiet, smiling theft conducted under the guise of compassion, a pickpocket who first offers a comforting arm to steady you. Martha sank into Frank's worn leather armchair, the springs groaning in protest as if in sympathy with her collapsing spirit. The leather was cool against her skin, but it offered no comfort, only a hollow, chilling reminder of the man who was no longer there to fill it, to warm it with his presence. Who? The question hammered at her. The mask of kindness shattered, and for the first time, Martha saw the raw, venomous resentment that had been hiding underneath it for years. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Susan hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "Oh, I think I do," Mr. Hayes said, opening his folder. He proceeded to lay out the entire case, piece by damning piece, his voice a calm, relentless monotone. He detailed the plagiarism of the diary, producing a copy of the e-book, and a forensic analysis comparing it to the original. He detailed the fraudulent grant application, complete with a copy Susan had saved on her cloud drive, a drive she paid for with Martha's money. He detailed the wire transfer to the shell company, providing incorporation documents that linked it directly to her brother. With each new piece of evidence, Susan seemed to shrink in her chair. When he was finished, she was silent. Her bravado was gone, replaced by a sullen, cornered fury. She looked at David, her expression shifting to one of a wounded victim. "David, you can't believe this. She's an old woman. She's confused. She's been making things up ever since your father died." "Stop," David said, his voice like ice. It was a single word, but it carried the weight of his shattered love and profound disgust. "Just stop talking, Susan." That's when she played her final card. She turned her venomous gaze back to Martha. "You think you've won? You want to do this? Fine. But by tomorrow, everyone will know your dirty little secret, your perfect son, your church friends, the whole town. They'll all know about the little bastard you threw away 50 years ago. Let's see how your precious reputation holds up then." It was the moment of truth, the final, desperate attack. But Martha was ready. She looked back at her daughter-in-law, not with fear, but with a profound and weary pity for the emptiness inside her. "That's not a secret anymore, Susan," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating in the silent room. "It's just a sad story from a long time ago. It's part of my life, and you don't get to have power over my life. Not anymore." The aftermath was messy and painful. Susan, faced with incontrovertible evidence and the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, accepted a plea bargain. She pleaded guilty to wire fraud and was sentenced to 2 years in a federal facility, with a further 5 years of probation and an order to pay full restitution, including the $25,000 grant and the stolen $5,000. The divorce between her and David was swift and bitter. The family, as Martha had known it, was broken. But from the ashes, something new began to grow. David, free from the subtle poison of Susan's influence, began to rebuild his life and his relationship with his mother. They talked more than they had in years, with a newfound honesty that was both painful and healing. He helped her navigate the legal and financial fallout, his respect and admiration for her strength growing with each passing day. The secret, once a source of shame, was now just a fact. Martha, with David's encouragement, even took a tentative step toward finding out what happened to the child she had given up. She submitted her information to an adoption reunion registry. She didn't know if she would ever make contact or if she even wanted to. But simply opening the door to that possibility was a form of healing, of accepting all the parts of her own story. Her final act of reclamation was for Frank. With the help of Eleanor and a local university press, she had his diary published, properly, under his own name. The book, titled Frank Peterson, A Soldier's Journey, was a modest success. All proceeds were donated to a charity for wounded veterans. At the book launch, standing before a small crowd at the local library, Martha read a passage from the diary. As she spoke her husband's words, his voice clear and true in her mind, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had protected his legacy. She had reclaimed her own. Life found a new equilibrium. It was quieter, smaller, but more authentic. The betrayal had left scars, but it had also revealed a strength she never knew she possessed. She had learned that evil can wear a smiling, helpful face, and that trust, once shattered, is a difficult thing to rebuild. But she had also learned that she was not as fragile as she thought. She was a survivor. Who would desecrate a memory so completely? And what else had they stolen? Before the silence had become a predator, it had been a comfort, a gentle companion in her new, solitary life. Martha had lived in this house for 47 years, every creak in the floorboards a familiar note in the symphony of her life with Frank. He was a man of quiet habits and deep, unshakable convictions, a personality forged in the crucible of Normandy and softened by a lifetime of loving her. The lessons from her ordeal were etched into her heart, not as a list of rules, but as a new way of being. She found a quiet satisfaction in logging into her own bank account now, in scrutinizing her own statements, a small act of asserting control that felt like a victory every time. She bought a journal of her own, its pages blank and waiting, and began to write down her own stories, her own memories, ensuring her narrative would always be her own. And sometimes she would look at an old photograph of herself as a young woman, a girl on the cusp of a terrible choice, and feel not a sting of shame, but a wave of compassion. She had done the best she could in a world that had offered her few options, and she had survived. The secret no longer had any power, because she had taken it back. Sitting in her garden, the late afternoon sun warming her face, Martha watched a bee move from one rose to another. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet now, the silence of sanctuary, not a tomb. She had faced the worst of betrayals, and had not only survived, but had emerged whole. Her past was her own, her present was secure, and her future, for the first time in a long time, felt truly and completely hers to write. Frank believed in three things with unwavering certainty: the strength of a good handshake, the importance of a meticulously balanced checkbook, and the sacred, unbreakable nature of a promise. You could build a world on those foundations, he'd always said, his hand resting on her knee as they sat on the porch swing in the evenings, the chains sighing a gentle rhythm, the scent of her climbing roses sweet in the twilight air. And they had. Their life was a testament to these beliefs, a quiet masterpiece of prudence and partnership. They had built their world brick by brick, a sturdy, unassuming structure of love and mutual respect. They saved diligently, tucking away a portion of every paycheck from his engineering firm and her job at the town library, a ritual they performed together at the end of each month at the oak dining table. They invested conservatively in things they understood, like municipal bonds and blue-chip stocks, tangible pieces of an America they believed in. Frank distrusted anything he couldn't explain on a single sheet of paper. They weren't ostentatious people. Their greatest luxuries were a well-tended rose garden bursting with Mr. Lincoln and peace roses, their vibrant colors a testament to Martha's care, and a yearly trip to the coast, where they'd walk the beach hand in hand, Frank collecting smooth, gray driftwood for her garden path while she looked for sea glass. But they were secure. Their financial plan, charted out on graph paper in Frank's meticulous, architectural hand, was a work of art, a map designed to see them through a long and peaceful retirement together. A future of quiet mornings with the newspaper, long walks in the afternoon sun, and grandchildren's laughter filling the rooms they had so carefully built. Frank's passing, a year and a half ago, from a sudden, aggressive cancer that had seemed to mock the careful planning of their lives, had fractured that plan. It had blown a hole through the center of the map, leaving a gaping void where their shared future had been. The future they had charted together now stretched before Martha as a lonely, uncharted territory, a vast and silent ocean. The house, once filled with his steady, reassuring presence, the rich, dark smell of his morning coffee brewing at 6 a.m. Sharp, the low murmur of the evening news from his armchair, the sound of his workshop tools on a Saturday afternoon sanding a piece of furniture back to life, now echoed with the hollowness of his absence, a resonant emptiness that vibrated in her very bones. In the initial dense fog of grief, her son David and his wife Susan had been her anchors. David, her gentle, earnest boy, had inherited his father's kindness, but not his iron will. The diary wasn't just a book. It was the faded photograph of their first dance tucked between the pages, the scent of his old pipe tobacco still clinging to the leather cover, the feel of his hand over hers as he'd read a passage aloud just last year. The afternoon sun cast long, menacing shadows across the polished hardwood of her study, the silence of the empty house suddenly feeling less like peace and more like a tomb. He was a good man, a loving son, but he worried constantly, his face a perpetual knot of concern for her well-being. He'd call 3 times a day, his voice tight with anxiety that seemed to seep through the phone line. "Are you eating, Mom? Did you remember to take your pills? Don't try to lift anything heavy in the garden. Maybe you should hire someone for that." His love was a warm blanket, but sometimes, in her darker moments, it felt suffocating, a gentle but constant reminder of her own perceived fragility. Susan, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of efficiency and modern competence. Where David offered emotional support, Susan offered solutions. She was the one who handled the mountain of estate paperwork, who navigated the labyrinth of insurance claims and pension notifications with an ease that baffled and awed Martha. She'd set up automatic bill payments for Martha from her own laptop, patiently explaining how the internet could simplify her life. "We don't want you worrying about a single thing, Mom," Susan would say, her smile bright and reassuring as she tapped away at the kitchen table, a sleek silver laptop humming quietly, a beacon of technological prowess. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with a speed Martha found mesmerizing, a staccato rhythm that was the sound of problems being solved. "You just focus on healing. Let us handle the details." Martha, a woman who had balanced her own checkbook to the penny for 5 decades, a task she secretly enjoyed for its order and certainty, had initially bristled at the idea of handing over control. It felt like a surrender, an admission of frailty she wasn't ready to make. "I'm perfectly capable, Susan," she'd insisted one afternoon, the pile of official-looking envelopes on the counter seeming to mock her with their bureaucratic jargon. "Of course you are," Susan had replied, her tone a perfect disarming blend of respect and gentle persuasion. "No one's saying you're not. But you're grieving, Martha. It's exhausting. The emotional toll makes everything else 10 times harder. Think of this as delegating. Like a CEO. You're the CEO of your life, and right now you're delegating the boring paperwork to your staff so you can focus on the big picture, getting better, okay?" The logic was so smooth, so modern, so reasonable. Grief was a powerful sedative, a heavy, invisible cloak. It leached the energy from her limbs and clouded her thoughts, making the simplest tasks, like sorting the mail, feel monumental. Each envelope was a demand she couldn't meet, a reminder of a world that kept moving on without Frank. And Susan was so capable, so confident. She spoke of portfolios, digital security, and online banking with a breezy fluency that made Martha feel like a relic from a bygone era, a hand-cranked telephone in a world of smartphones. Slowly, gratefully, Martha had let go. She trusted her son, and by extension, she trusted his wife. Susan was family, after all. She saw the pure, unadulterated love David had for her, the way he looked at her as if she were the answer to a question he'd always been asking. Martha wanted to believe in that love, in the stability of her son's choice. She wanted her son to be happy, and Susan made him happy. That, more than anything, was what had earned her trust. The diary had been one of Frank's most private possessions. He'd kept it in a locked metal box in his study, a small, dark green, leather-bound volume filled with his elegant, sloping script. It chronicled his journey as a young soldier, from the fear-soaked, vomit-stinking landing craft approaching the beaches of D-Day, through the bloody, claustrophobic hedgerows of France, to the bittersweet, champagne-soaked liberation of Paris. It wasn't just a record of battles and troop movements. It was a philosophical journey. It was where a boy, barely 19, became a man. It was where he wrestled with mortality, with a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, with the bewildering cruelty of the world and the unexpected, life-affirming kindness of strangers. After he was gone, Martha had found the key in an old cigar box filled with his medals and commendations. Reading the diary was like having a conversation with the young man she'd never known, the one whose eyes held the shadows of things he would never, could never, speak of. This wasn't a mistake, not a simple misunderstanding. It was a violation, a quiet, smiling theft. Who would desecrate a memory so completely? And what else had they stolen? The name on the author page wasn't her husband's. It was a stranger's. S.D. Richards. The letters blurred through the sudden hot film of tears in Martha's eyes, a cruel and unexpected distortion of reality. It was her most precious connection to him, a tangible piece of his history that was now hers to protect. One evening, about 6 months ago, Susan had come upon her in the study. Martha was sitting in Frank's chair, reading by the light of a single lamp, tears tracing silent, glistening paths down her cheeks. The words on the page were about Frank seeing a friend, a boy from Iowa named Billy, killed by a sniper. The description was spare, brutal, and heartbreakingly real. Susan had entered so quietly Martha hadn't heard her. She just suddenly felt a hand on her arm, a comforting weight. The gesture felt so genuine, so warm. "That's such a treasure, Martha," she'd said softly, her voice a respectful hush. "An important piece of history. You know, pages like that, they fade. The acid in the paper, the ink, it all breaks down. It's so fragile." "It's all I have left of that part of him," Martha had whispered, her voice thick with unshed grief. "Sometimes I feel like if I read it too much, the words will just lift off the page and disappear, that my own tears will smudge them away." "I have an idea," Susan had said, her voice filled with what seemed like manufactured inspiration, a light bulb moment perfectly timed for maximum effect. "I have a high-resolution scanner at my office. It's professional grade, the kind museums use. I could digitize it for you, create a perfect digital copy. That way the original can be stored safely in a vault or a safe deposit box, away from light and humidity. And you, David, the grandkids. Everyone can read Frank's story without ever damaging the book. It'll be preserved forever." The offer seemed so thoughtful, so purely good. It was a modern solution to an old-world problem. Martha had pictured her great-grandchildren, generations from now, reading about their ancestors' heroism on some futuristic device she couldn't even imagine. The idea of Frank's legacy being secured by technology, the very thing she found so baffling and intimidating, was deeply appealing. With a heart full of gratitude, she had agreed. She watched as Susan handled the diary with what appeared to be the utmost reverence, placing it carefully inside a cushioned laptop case as if it were a holy relic. "I'll take such good care of it," Susan had promised, her eyes meeting Martha's, a look of sincere gravity on her face. "This is a sacred trust. I won't let you down." The diary was gone for 2 weeks. When Susan returned it, she also presented Martha with a small silver USB drive on a keychain. "It's all on here," she'd announced proudly, holding it up like a trophy. "Every single page, crystal clear. I even ran it through a program that makes the text searchable. So if you ever want to find what he wrote about a specific place or date, you can just type it in." Martha had thanked her profusely, her heart swelling with affection for this woman who seemed to care so much for her family's history, for Frank's memory. The diary went back into its metal box, and the USB drive was placed beside it, a modern key for an old lock. Life settled back into its quiet rhythm. Susan continued to help with the finances, sending Martha neat printouts of her accounts each month. David called every day. Martha tended to her roses, the ghosts of her life with Frank, her constant, comforting companions. She felt safe. She felt cared for. She had trusted them with her present, her finances, her security. And with the diary, she had unknowingly trusted them with her past and with the secrets it held. Secrets she didn't even know were there. The first flicker of doubt arrived like a misdelivered letter, an anomaly in the predictable post. Martha was trying to order a new set of gardening shears online, a task that still felt like navigating a foreign country with a poorly translated map. She'd accidentally closed the right window and found herself on a page of search results for something she didn't recognize. One link, however, caught her eye. It was an article on a blog dedicated to military history titled "The Lost Voices of the Bulge, an Unseen Perspective." Frank had been there, in the bitter cold of the Ardennes. Curious and a little bored, she clicked. The article was well written, filled with poignant details about the daily life of a soldier in that brutal, frozen landscape. It felt authentic. One passage struck her with a jolt of familiarity so sharp it was like a physical blow, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The snow wasn't white, it read. It was a tired, defeated gray, the color of a widow's shawl. Her late Frank's words, his very soul poured onto the fragile, yellowed pages of his war diary, were being sold for $2.99 on a website she'd never heard of, a digital marketplace of ghosts and stolen memories. This was impossible, a phantom limb twitching in the modern world, a haunting she couldn't begin to comprehend. It didn't fall so much as it surrendered, blanketing the bodies of boys who would never go home, erasing them from the world with a soft, indifferent finality. Martha's breath caught in her throat. She stood up so quickly the chair scraped against the floor, a harsh, grating sound in the quiet study. Her hand pressed to her chest, as if to still her suddenly frantic heart. She walked on unsteady legs to the bookshelf. She fumbled with the key to the metal box, her fingers suddenly clumsy and trembling, refusing to cooperate. She finally got it open and lifted the diary out. She opened it to the winter of 1944, her eyes scanning the familiar, elegant script. And there it was. Frank's words, faded but clear. The snow here isn't white. It's a tired, defeated gray, the color of a widow's shawl. It isn't falling. It's surrendering, blanketing the fellows we can't get to, erasing them. It was almost verbatim. Chills raced down her spine, prickling her skin. A coincidence? It had to be. Of course it was. Perhaps it was a common sentiment among soldiers who had seen such things. A shared metaphor born of shared trauma. She tried to dismiss it, to close the laptop and walk away, to go out into her garden and let the sun and the soil chase the cold feeling away. But a seed of unease had been planted in the fertile soil of her grief. It was a nasty, invasive weed, and it was already starting to sprout. Later that week, she tried to find the article again. She couldn't remember the blog's name. On a whim, a whisper of intuition she couldn't ignore, she typed the entire phrase, "the color of a widow's shawl," into the search bar. The blog appeared again, but so did something else. A link to an online bookstore. An e-book titled Gray Snowfall by an author named S.D. Richards. The cover was a generic stock photo of a snowy forest. The description promised a raw, unflinching account of the European theater based on newly discovered primary sources. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of dread. S.D. Richards, Susan, David, Richards. It couldn't be. It was a monstrous, unthinkable leap, a conspiracy theory spun from grief and loneliness. Her mind was playing tricks on her. With a shaking finger, she clicked the Look Inside preview. The first page was a dedication to the quiet heroes whose stories deserve to be told. The words were a mockery, a bitter poison on her tongue. The first chapter began, and Martha felt the world tilt on its axis. It was Frank's voice. His cadence, his unique, slightly formal turns of phrase, his private thoughts about his commanding officer, his bone-deep fear during a nighttime patrol, his desperate, aching longing for a home he wasn't sure he'd ever see again. It was all there, slightly rephrased, polished for a modern reader, stripped of its raw immediacy, but unmistakably his, stolen. His life, his trauma, his very soul, packaged and sold for pocket change by a person with the initials SDR. She scrolled numbly through the preview, a wave of nausea cresting inside her, hot and acidic. Then she saw it. A line in the author's bio at the bottom of the page. SD. Richards is an independent researcher specializing in military history whose work is funded in part by the esteemed Veterans Legacy Grant. A grant? The word hung in the air, venomous and cold. Susan had mentioned grants. A few months back, she'd been bubbling with excitement about a writer friend who had received one. She'd explained it was money given by foundations to support important projects. Had she used Frank's diary to get money? The betrayal was no longer a simple, grubby plagiarism. It was a calculated financial fraud. The helpfulness, the smiles, the patient explanations of technology, it was all a lie. A meticulously crafted performance. Susan hadn't been preserving Frank's memory. She'd been mining it for profit. Martha slammed the laptop shut, the sound cracking the oppressive silence of the study like a gunshot. The room felt cold, alien. The familiar objects, Frank's chair, his reading lamp, the photos of them on the wall from 50 years of anniversaries, seemed like props on a stage where she was the unwitting audience to a cruel play. She felt a profound sense of violation, as if a stranger had walked through her home, touching all her cherished possessions with greedy, filthy hands. The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her son was married to a thief, a con artist. Susan, her kind, tech-savvy daughter-in-law, the one who had handled everything with such effortless competence since Frank's passing, had sworn the digitizing process was just for family, a private archive to preserve Frank's memory. A sacred trust, she'd called it, her voice hushed with a reverence Martha had found so deeply touching at the time. The diary wasn't just a book. It was a reliquary of their life together, a vessel holding the intangible essence of their shared history. A woman who could look a grieving widow in the eye and lie with such practiced, smiling ease. The silver USB drive on the desk seemed to mock her, a silver bullet aimed directly at her heart. She had willingly handed over the weapon. The depth of her own foolishness, her own trusting nature, was a second, sharper agony. She had not only been betrayed by Susan, she had failed Frank. She had failed to protect the one thing he had trusted solely to her, and the most terrifying thought of all began to form in the darkness of her mind. If Susan could do this, what else had she done? This question was the beginning of the crisis, the moment the ground gave way to a chasm. Her first instinct was to grab the phone, to call David, to scream into the receiver, to expose the lie with a torrent of rage and pain. But she stopped, her hand hovering over the familiar cradle. What would she say? That his wife, the woman he adored, the brilliant, capable center of his universe, was a fraud? That she had stolen his dead father's life story? He would defend her. Of course he would. He would say it was a misunderstanding, a tribute gone wrong. He would say Susan meant to tell her, that she was just waiting for the right moment. He would look for any explanation other than the ugly, unthinkable truth, because the truth would shatter his world as surely as it was shattering hers. In their quiet conflict, Martha knew who would appear more credible. Susan, with her calm, rational demeanor, would dismantle her accusations with surgical precision. And Martha? She would be cast as the villain, the grieving, confused old woman, paranoid and lashing out, unable to cope with the modern world. The narrative was already written in Susan's favor. Martha realized with a sickening lurch that she was utterly, terrifyingly alone in this. She had no proof beyond a gut feeling and a few familiar phrases. She needed more. She needed an arsenal. With a resolve she hadn't felt since the day Frank received his diagnosis, Martha began her own quiet investigation. She opened the laptop again, her movements no longer frantic but slow and deliberate. An icy calm settled over her, a strange cold fire in her veins. She navigated back to the bookstore page and bought the e-book. Every page that loaded onto her screen was a fresh torment, a new stab of grief and rage. She printed it out, the printer in the corner, whirring through the night, a mechanical accomplice in her grim task, spitting out page after page of stolen memories. She sat at the large oak dining room table, the diary on her left, the printed manuscript on her right, a pot of strong black coffee at her elbow. With a red pen, she began to draw the lines. She cross-referenced every paragraph, every anecdote, every turn of phrase. The parallels were damning, irrefutable. Entire sections were lifted with only minor words changed. Fellows became soldiers. Awful became terrible. Frank's raw, immediate prose was repackaged into something smoother, more commercial, but the bones were all his. The soul was his. Then she searched for the Veterans Legacy Grant. It was real. A prestigious fellowship awarded by a historical society to historians and writers for projects that bring untold veteran stories to light. The grant was for $25,000. The amount made her dizzy. The list of recent recipients was public, a downloadable PDF. Her hand shook as she clicked the link. And there it was, halfway down the page, Susan Richards. Project title, Gray Snowfall, The Diary of an American Infantryman. The project description praised her sensitive curation of a newly discovered family artifact. Family artifact. The phrase was a mockery, a piece of corporate jargon used to sanitize an act of profound desecration. Martha felt a cold fury replace the hot panic. This wasn't just about a book. It was about a significant sum of money, obtained under false pretenses. This was grand larceny disguised as scholarship. Her investigation deepened, fueled by sleepless nights and bitter coffee. The house grew dark around her as she fell down the rabbit hole of Susan's deception. She started looking at the bank statements Susan so helpfully printed for her each month, the ones she had previously only glanced at. At first, everything seemed normal. The mortgage, the utilities, the grocery bills. But then she started noticing the small things, the financial mosquitoes that had been bleeding her dry. A recurring monthly charge of $49.95 to a company called Data Safe Cloud Storage. It was the faded decal-edged photograph of their first dance at the WWII hall, tucked carefully between the pages detailing the brutal, soul-crushing winter of '44. Frank's youthful face, all sharp angles and earnest hope, was a stark, heartbreaking contrast to the horrors his elegant pen described. A one-time payment of $300 to Veritext editing services, another for $150 to a book cover Designs Inc. Small amounts, easily overlooked, lost in the noise of daily life. On their own, they meant nothing, but in the context of the book, they were a confession in neat digital columns. Susan hadn't just used her scanner. She had used Martha's money to fund the production of the very thing she was stealing. She was paying for the theft with the victim's own funds. The sheer audacity of it left Martha breathless. The real blow, the one that almost broke her, came from a place she never expected. As she continued to read Frank's diary, comparing it to the book, she reached the final entries. These were written not during the war, but years later, in the last decade of his life. They were more reflective, more personal. Frank wrote about their life together, about raising David, about his fears for the future, and then she found an entry from the year before he died. It was a long one, his handwriting a little shakier than usual, the ink slightly faded. "Martha told me everything tonight," he wrote. "The whole story. All the pain she's carried for 50 years. A secret she thought she had to bear alone. My God, the strength of that woman. To hold that inside, to build a life, a family, on top of that fault line. She called it her great shame, but I call it her great survival. I told her it changes nothing. It only makes me love her more. I am taking this secret with me, but I write it here, just once, so that the truth of her incredible strength is recorded somewhere in the universe. It is a secret for the earth and for the worms, for no one else's eyes. Martha stared at the page, the blood draining from her face. The room seemed to recede, the sounds of the house fading to a dull roar in her ears. She knew what secret he meant. A secret from long before she met Frank. A youthful mistake born of loneliness and desperation in a time that was unforgiving to young women. A brief, foolish affair that had resulted in a choice no young woman should have to make. She had given up a child for adoption. It was a deep, buried wound, one she had only ever confessed to her priest, and in his final days to her husband. It was her shame, her private, lifelong grief. Frank, in his infinite love and wisdom, had taken that confession and turned it into a testament to her strength. The thought that Susan had read this, that she had scanned this page with her high-resolution scanner, was a violation so profound it left her breathless. It was a spiritual trespass, a desecration of the most sacred confidence of her life. She frantically searched the e-book, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The secret wasn't there. A small, cold knot of relief formed in her stomach, but it was immediately followed by a more terrifying question. If Susan hadn't used it in the book, why not? It was the most dramatic part of Martha's life story, a guaranteed seller, the kind of emotional twist that publishers loved. The answer that came to her was so chilling it made her skin crawl. A secret like that isn't something you publish for a one-time profit. It's something you keep, something you hold. It was leverage. It was a weapon held in reserve for a bigger prize, and Martha, looking at the portfolio statements Susan had so neatly organized for her, with their columns of stocks and bonds and the deed to the house listed as an asset, knew exactly what that prize was. Everything. The full scope of the betrayal was now laid bare. It was a multi-layered, long-term campaign. The theft of the diary was the entry point. The grant money was the initial profit. The small siphoned funds were for operational costs. And the secret was the end game. Susan wasn't just a plagiarist. She was a predator, a patient, smiling predator who had embedded herself in their family and was now poised to devour it from the inside out. The despair was a black ocean, and Martha was drowning in it. Every memory of Susan's kindness was now tainted, every thoughtful gesture a calculated move in a cruel and silent game. Her home was no longer a sanctuary, it was a crime scene, and she, the trusting fool, had polished the silver for the robber. The journey back began not with a roar, but with a whisper. For 3 days, Martha moved through her house like a ghost, the printed manuscript and the red-lined diary pages spread across the dining table like the entrails of a sacrificed animal. The weight of Susan's betrayal was a physical pressure, a suffocating blanket of despair that made each breath a conscious effort. It was the ghost scent of his old pipe tobacco, a cherry-vanilla blend he'd favored for over 60 years, a scent that still clung tenaciously to the worn leather cover, so vivid she could almost taste the sweet smoke on the back of her tongue, a sensory memory that made her chest ache with a hollow physical pain. She didn't answer the phone when it rang, knowing it was David, his voice full of a concern she could no longer accept at face value, knowing he would ask if Susan had called, if she had dropped off the groceries. She couldn't eat. The toast she forced down in the morning turned to ash in her mouth. She'd pick up one of Frank's books from the shelf, his scent still clinging to the pages, and feel a fresh wave of failure wash over her. She had failed to protect him. Sleep offered no escape, only fractured nightmares of Susan's smiling face twisting into a sneer, of Frank's diary pages turning to ash in her hands. She looked at the phone 100 times, her thumb hovering over David's number, but she could never press it. How could she detonate her own son's life? How could she tell him the foundation of his happiness was a meticulously constructed lie? The isolation was absolute. She was a prisoner in her own home, held captive by a secret that was not her own. On the fourth day, staring at the withered petals of a rose in the vase on the table, she thought of Eleanor. Eleanor Vance. They had been friends for 30 years, ever since their sons were in Cub Scouts together, arguing over who could tie the best square knot. Eleanor was a retired librarian, a woman with a mind as sharp as a tack and a healthy dose of cynicism that Martha had always found both amusing and exhausting. Eleanor didn't trust easily. She read the fine print on everything. She was the kind of woman who would bring her own calculator to the bank just to double-check the teller's math. Right now, Martha needed that cynicism more than anything. She needed an ally who wouldn't try to soften the truth. With a trembling hand, she picked up the phone and dialed. "Eleanor," she said, her voice a dry rasp she barely recognized. "It's Martha." "Martha, I was about to call the cavalry. You haven't answered your phone in 3 days. David called me yesterday, worried sick." "I know. I'm sorry. Her voice trailed off. She couldn't form the words. The chasm between what she knew and what she could say felt impossibly wide. "Are you all right? You sound terrible. Could you come over? I need some help with the computer." It was a feeble pretext, but it was the only one she could manage. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence freighted with Eleanor's sharp intuition. Martha knew Eleanor could hear the lie, the tremor of something much deeper and darker than a computer problem. "I'll be there in an hour," Eleanor said, her voice suddenly all business. "Don't you move." Eleanor arrived an hour later, carrying a Tupperware container of lemon bars and an expression of shrewd concern that bypassed all social niceties. "The computer! My foot!" she said, setting the container on the counter and pulling Martha into a brief, firm hug that was more bracing than comforting. She looked at Martha's pale, drawn face, the dark circles under her eyes. "What's wrong, Marty? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Martha whispered, leading her into the dining room. "I've seen a monster." And so the story spilled out. At first, it was a trickle of disjointed facts. The blog, the e-book, the familiar phrases. Then, fueled by Eleanor's quiet, focused attention, it became a flood. She showed Eleanor the monument of paper and red ink. She pointed to the grant money, the bank statements, the damning parallels. Martha spoke for nearly 2 hours, her voice cracking, her hands twisting a napkin in her lap until it shredded. She told Eleanor everything, except for the final, most painful secret from the diary. She couldn't bring herself to speak those words aloud, not yet. Eleanor listened without interruption, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She examined the manuscript, her eyes scanning the pages with the practiced speed of a librarian. She tapped the table with a perfectly manicured nail, a rhythmic sound in the tense silence of the room. When Martha finally fell silent, exhausted and raw, Eleanor didn't offer platitudes or comforting hugs. She looked Martha straight in the eye, her expression one of cold, concentrated fury, and said 4 words that changed everything. "The snake will gut her." That was the spark. Eleanor's cold, clear-eyed fury was the antidote to Martha's despair. For the first time in days, Martha felt a flicker of something other than helpless victimhood. She felt anger. She felt the beginning of a fight. "She's clever, Eleanor," Martha whispered, the fight still fragile within her. "She's covered her tracks." It was the phantom feel of his large, warm, calloused hand over hers as he'd read a passage aloud just last year. His voice, roughened and thinned by age, still carrying the vibrant echoes of the young soldier who had written the words in a frozen foxhole half a world away. "Listen to this, Marty," he'd said, his eyes twinkling with wry amusement over the top of his reading glasses. "I was trying so hard to sound like a philosopher. Thought I was Marcus Aurelius in a foxhole. It's my word against hers." David will see the truth when we show it to him," Eleanor interrupted, her voice firm as steel. "But we don't go to David yet. We go to war. And you don't go to war without ammunition. Right now, you have suspicions and circumstantial evidence. We need proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof that will make it impossible for anyone, especially David, to look the other way." For the next 2 weeks, Martha's quiet home transformed into a command center. Eleanor, it turned out, was a formidable digital detective. "Librarians, my dear," she said one afternoon, peering at the laptop screen over her reading glasses, "are the original search engines. We know how to find things people want to keep hidden. Dewey Decimal is nothing compared to a deceitful daughter-in-law." They started with the digital trail. Eleanor taught Martha how to look at website source code, how to find cached pages on internet archives to see past versions of the blog. They discovered that Susan had started the blog nearly a year ago, just weeks after she first borrowed the diary. The early posts were clumsy, filled with historical inaccuracies, but they became more polished and confident over time as she delved deeper into Frank's lived experience. They found the original grant application, a masterpiece of sentimental fiction where Susan described her emotional journey of discovering her husband's family history and her solemn duty to share this quintessential American story. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They created a new anonymous email address and began to probe. Eleanor, posing as a sharp, no-nonsense prospective literary agent named Brenda Finch, sent an email to the contact address for S.D. Richards. She praised Gray Snowfall for its raw power and authenticity and inquired about future projects. The response from Susan was immediate and arrogant. She boasted of having exclusive access to a trove of unpublished historical documents and hinted at a forthcoming, more personal family story that would be truly explosive. She even mentioned that securing the rights from the elderly family member who owned the source material would be a delicate but ultimately achievable negotiation. The threat was no longer implicit. It was there, in black and white, a signed confession of her intent. While Eleanor handled the digital front, Martha focused on the paper trail. She went to the bank, a place she hadn't set foot in for over a year. She was nervous, feeling foolish and ancient as she asked the young teller for paper copies of all her statements for the past 18 months. The teller was patient, but Martha felt a flush of shame. She was supposed to be in control of her life, a capable woman, not a befuddled old lady who had let her finances be managed by someone else. The shame hardened into resolve. Never again. Back at the house, she and Eleanor spread the statements across the living room floor like a giant, depressing puzzle. They went through them line by line. The small charges they'd found were just the beginning. There were payments to stock photography websites, subscriptions to genealogical services, payments for social media advertising to promote the book. And then they found something bigger. 3 months ago, there was a wire transfer of $5,000 to an investment LLC she had never heard of. Richards & Sons Holdings. Martha's heart sank. She remembered the conversation vividly. Susan had sat with her at the kitchen table, her laptop open, showing her a glossy online brochure. "It's a real estate fund, Martha. A sure thing. My brother-in-law runs it. It's a small private group, but I told them about you, and they're willing to let you in. The returns are fantastic. Much better than those dusty old bonds Frank liked." Martha had been hesitant, but Susan had been so persuasive, so confident. "Frank's strategy was wonderful for his time," she'd said kindly, her hand covering Martha's. "But the world has changed. You have to make your money work for you. Let's not let this nest egg just sit there." Martha had trusted her. She had signed the form, and Susan had handled the online transfer. Now, looking at the statement, she saw the truth. The money was gone. Eleanor did a quick search on the LLC. It had been formed 6 months ago, had no assets, and its registered agent was Susan's brother. It wasn't an investment. It was a shell company. It was theft, plain and simple. "This is beyond a family squabble now, Marty," Eleanor said, her voice grim. "What a pompous little ass I was." She'd laughed then, a real, full-throated laugh, and slapped his arm playfully. The memory was so clear, so recent, it felt like a betrayal from her own mind. The afternoon sun, slanting through the panes of the study window, cast long, menacing shadows across the polished hardwood floor, transforming familiar shapes into grotesque and unfamiliar figures. "This is a felony. Wire fraud, exploitation of the elderly. You need a lawyer." Martha recoiled at the word. A lawyer meant making it official. It meant police and courts. It meant destroying her family, putting her son through an unimaginable hell. "I can't," she said, shaking her head. David is a grown man," Eleanor said, her tone softening slightly but losing none of its iron. "He needs to know who he married. Protecting him from the truth isn't an act of love. It's an act of fear. You cannot let this woman do this to you. You cannot let her take Frank's name and your security and get away with it. Frank wouldn't stand for it. And neither should you." Eleanor knew a man, Arthur Hayes, a semi-retired lawyer who specialized in estate planning and probate. "He's a bulldog," Eleanor had said, "and he hates bullies." Meeting Mr. Hayes was the next step on the journey. He was a small, neat man with piercing blue eyes and a surprisingly gentle demeanor that seemed at odds with his reputation. Martha, accompanied by Eleanor for moral support, sat in his quiet, book-lined office and told the story again. This time, fortified by weeks of research, her voice was steady. She laid out the printed emails from Brenda Finch, the annotated manuscript, the highlighted bank statements. She presented the case with a clarity and precision that surprised even herself. Mr. Hayes listened, his face impassive, occasionally making a small note on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, he was silent for a full minute, constructing his thoughts. "Mrs. Peterson," he said finally, his voice calm and measured. "In my 40 years of practice, I have seen the worst of human nature, very often within families. What your daughter-in-law has done is not just unethical, it is a calculated and criminal campaign of fraud and exploitation. You have an exceptionally strong case." He then paused, his gaze intensifying. "But I have to ask you a difficult question. In her emails to your friend's alias, she alludes to a more explosive story. Do you have any idea what she might be referring to?" The air left the room. This was the moment she had been dreading. She looked at Eleanor, whose expression was one of quiet, unwavering support. Martha took a deep breath. The secret had been her burden for over 50 years. Susan was trying to turn it into a weapon. Perhaps the only way to disarm a weapon like that was to bring it into the light herself. "Yes," Martha said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a secret from my past, something that happened before I met my husband." And for the third time, she told the story. But this time, she told all of it. She spoke of being a lonely, naive girl in a new city, of a brief, regrettable affair with a man who made promises he never intended to keep. She spoke of the shame and terror of an unplanned pregnancy in a time when such things could ruin a woman's life forever. She spoke of the difficult decision, the anonymous agency, the child she never knew. The confession, spoken aloud in that quiet, safe office, did not feel shameful. It felt liberating. The release of a pressure she had held inside for a lifetime. Mr. Hayes listened, his expression unchanged. "I see," he said when she was done. "This is a classic extortion tactic. She plans to use the threat of revealing this information to coerce you into signing over power of attorney, changing your will, or giving her direct access to your assets. She is counting on your sense of shame and your desire to protect your family's reputation." He leaned forward, his blue eyes sharp. "But here is the thing about shame, Mrs. Peterson. It only has power in the dark. You've just taken the first step in turning on the lights. Our strategy is now twofold. We pursue the criminal charges for the fraud and theft, and we prepare to neutralize the blackmail threat." Neutralizing the threat meant telling David there was no other way. Mr. Hayes advised her to do it before they made any legal move against Susan. Martha had to control the narrative. She had to be the one to tell her son the truth, all of it. The drive home was silent. The prospect of her confession to David was more terrifying than facing Susan in a courtroom. That night, she couldn't eat. She sat in Frank's armchair, the diary in her lap, and read his words again. She called it her great shame, but I call it her great survival. Frank had known, and it had not lessened his love, it had deepened it. She had to believe in her son, had to believe he was made of the same strong, compassionate material as his father. She called him the next morning. "David, darling, can you come over this afternoon?" "Alone. There's something important we need to discuss."